Okay, we're on to types of breathing. And at this point, maybe you're feeling a little out of breath. I know that usually happens because we talk about breathing. You're going to learn more about breathing than you ever knew, and then maybe more than you want to know. But there's actually names for the different kinds of breathing a person can do. Eupnea, I've looked this up, is normal breathing in and out, like it says there, diaphragm, external intercostals. Dyspnea, excuse me, strenuous breathing could be during exercise, could be if your person has a cold, pneumonia, COPD. More muscles are required for that. Tachypnea. Tachy usually refers to elevated. That's an elevated breathing rate. People who run a fever have a higher breathing rate. Bradypnea is decreased or depressed breathing below 12 or 15 respirations. And then apnea is complete cessation of breathing. That's why it's called sleep apnea, people who stop breathing during the night. Just one mention about this. Breathing is voluntary. We had covered this in our last video, but here's the pons, the medulla. You do have conscious control over your breathing rate. You can hold your breath. But there is a point where if a person held their breath long enough, they'd pass out. And then that part of the brain, the medulla, would then continue to send out signals. And barring any major health incident, that person would start breathing again. So just like it says there, eventually the medulla would stimulate breathing again to supply tissue with oxygen. Yeah, demand would override all that. Okay, factors that can affect a person's breathing rate. These are the same factors that came into play when it had to do with how blood flow goes through capillary beds. These are factors that increase, I love that. These are factors that would increase a person's breathing rate. If they're low on oxygen, that's probably a no-brainer. If they're high in carbon dioxide or an increase, their blood is getting acidic, more hydrogen ions. These last two, the brain is more sensitive to those than it is a drop in oxygen. What are the factors that would decrease breathing rate? Yes, if there's plenty of oxygen in the blood, there's no reason to breathe harder. A decrease in carbon dioxide, a decrease in blood acidity, there's no stimulus there. Those are chemical factors. So all of these are going to cause breathing rate to drop. If a person hyperventilates at some point, their breathing rate is going to drop back down to normal and maybe even below normal. This just talks about just a little bit about how the chemoreceptors, they really, oxygen can fall to a pretty low level and there's no stimulus for breathing. The carotid bodies in the aorta, and this is where we had left off with the last video, but I didn't mean to do that. Up in this area, see these nerve innervations. These are the carotid bodies. See these coming down to the aorta. They detect the stretching, pressure changes, and they're also very sensitive to chemical changes in blood. Okay, so a real brief part to this, and then we're going to get to the complicated part. Alveolar gas exchange. You need to be able to tell, and here are the numbers you want to be looking at. So I covered this already. Blood going through the lungs, this represents an alveolus, the alveolar sac, the alveoli, which is the plural version. Alveolus is the singular version. So blood flowing through here is low on oxygen, and these are decent numbers. The little P right here represents the partial pressure. That's what contributes to the pressure overall of a gas. I wouldn't worry too much about that. But if you measured the PCO2 of blood going into the lungs, it's got that blue color, the CO2 level will be about 45 millimeters of mercury. The oxygen level will be about 40. Those are actually legit numbers. In the lungs, a person's breathing normally, they're going to have a very high oxygen level because that's where, the atmosphere, you're having air moving in and out of the lungs. Same time, when you breathe off carbon dioxide. You ventilate that off. So that number is going to be very low, or not very low, but lower. Here's 45. here's 40. So even though it's not a huge gradient, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse across this membrane. It's very permeable. This is simple squamous epithelium. CO2 is going to move from here to the lungs by diffusion, and then oxygen, which is 104 here and 40 here. Now this is going to happen at a much faster rate. Oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood, and so the blood leaving, it's all binding to hemoglobin. The registering number here is about 104. It's a little high. It might be, 196. It just depends. And you see the CO2 level has dropped down to 40 because of the diffusion that occurred here. And that's why it's got this red color. And now that's going to go to body tissues. So that is alveolar gas exchange. Now, gas exchange at the cellular level. Now this kind of briefly, once again, here's an alveolus. These represent hemoglobin. Little red dots are oxygen. You see them being loaded up as they go through the lungs. Now this is showing, and I can make this a little bigger, and you can too if you want to on your computer when you're looking at this. So blood here, PO2 is about 95 millimeters of mercury. That's probably more accurate than 104. Tissue cells use oxygen to convert food energy into ATP. So it's always going to be a low number because they're constantly using it. And in the process of using oxygen, they are producing carbon dioxide, which is not on this particular diagram. But this is showing, see the blood going through, it's unloading oxygen. And then the blood leaving is getting this blue color because now the PO2 of oxygen is about 40. If there were actual numbers on this, you'd have carbon dioxide moving into this while this is going through. The CO2 level would be 40 here, millimeters of mercury, and then leaving this tissue area would be about 45 because it's going to have a higher level here than in blood because cells produce carbon dioxide in response to using oxygen. Okay, so that's gas exchange at the cellular level. Okay, this is the detailed part of this section, and you do have some alternative ways of looking at this. There's an example of alveolar gas exchange. There's a surfactant. See, there's a type 2 cell, a type 1. We talked about all that. Here's another example. This is just a little bit of information about diffusion and gradients. The picture I just showed you. And now we are to what is called the carbonic acid formula. All right. So how are gases transported in blood? Oxygen is very simple. Oxygen, 2% is dissolved in plasma. Plasma, remember, has gases. It's got fibrinogen, albumins, globulins. Remember, it has water, proteins. It's got all kinds of things. It has a little bit of dissolved gas in plasma. So 2% of the oxygen, and I'm talking about in this example, I'm going to go back up here. So this example, either here, well, let's say here. Oxygen being transported in blood, 98% is bound to hemoglobin. You can see it loading up here. 2% dissolves in plasma. And a couple of terms, hemoglobin, when it's bound to oxygen, remember this, it's called oxyhemoglobin. It's got a red color to it. When it releases it, it's actually referred to as deoxyhemoglobin, which there it is at the bottom. All that is taking place here. That's why it's a red colored here. Here's some oxyhemoglobin. Even though there's still some oxygen bound here, it's still deoxyhemoglobin. It's got a lower level. It's got the blue color. So oxygen is very simple. Carbon dioxide, whole different story. How is carbon dioxide a toxic gas? You have to get rid of this in blood. Watch Apollo 13. You don't believe me? It's a big section in that movie where they had to make a CO2 scrubber because basically there was 3 men in the limb, and it was made to support 2 people, and the carbon dioxide level is building up. and at some point they would have asphyxiated or passed out. It would have caused a lot of trouble. So you have to get rid of carbon dioxide. And human beings and animals that undergo cell respiration, we breathe off CO2 and water. You got to keep that in mind during this whole process. You don't breathe off anything else. When everything reaches the lungs, you breathe off water and carbon dioxide. And you're getting oxygen from the atmosphere. So, transport of carbon dioxide. Some of it combines with hemoglobin. So it actually, I don't want to give you a headache bouncing. So some of it actually combines to hemoglobin. There's a carrier portion on hemoglobin for carbon dioxide. It's called carbaminohemoglobin. Some of it is dissolved in plasma. I'll show you this here in a second. And this is really talking about when carbon dioxide is being picked up. See, I'm sorry to go back. This diagram right here, when carbon dioxide is being loaded into the blood as the blood is going through body tissues, and like I said, it's going to eventually go back to the lungs to be exhaled. So we're talking about this first example is right here. The next example is what happens when it gets in the lungs. So 2%, well, it doesn't even say 2%. It says a very small percentage, is dissolved in plasma as carbon dioxide. The majority of carbon dioxide is transported in this little formula here. It's called the carbonic acid formula. You need to know it. It's a reversible reaction. All chemical reactions are reversible. So here it is. And the majority of carbon dioxide is transported in the form of what's called a bicarbonate ion. This HCO3 negative. Dang it. Yeah, it says most carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. And then it will break apart into this, and that's how it's carried in the blood. But like I was saying, you do not breathe off hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. You breathe off water and CO2. So here we go. You can play this back all you want. This is a big part of your quiz. So here is CO2 and water. There's actually an enzyme in blood that forces this reaction. H2CO3 is carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is not very stable. Once it forms in this direction, it breaks into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. That's what this is, a bicarbonate ion. Here are the two hydrogens. See the H2. There's 3 oxygens. There's 1 oxygen. There's 2 oxygens. And there's the 1 carbon. See, it's all balanced. Now, this is how it's transported in blood. When it reaches the lungs, there's actually an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. It will catalyze a reaction between bicarbonate and this hydrogen ion to form carbonic acid again. Carbonic acid will then dissociate into CO2 and water, and that is actually ventilated off into the atmosphere. So here's a cell. So just pretend we're talking about this example right here. So there's those, 6 cells there. I know those are square. This is a round one. All right, so here's the first contestant. It says tissue cell, and it's got PCO2 is about 45, and blood, like I was saying, blood that's going through tissue cells, it's 40 because it's already gone through the lungs. Okay, well, here is the CO2 dissolved in plasma. See that arrow it's showing, it's going this way. Here's a part of it that comes down and combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. So plasma, red blood cell, and that happens, of course, inside of a red cell. So the majority of CO2, it moves inside of a red blood cell. And remember, plasma is 92% water. It combines with a water molecule to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will then disassociate or split into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, which stays inside the red blood cell as it combines with hemoglobin. This moves out into the plasma, and then you see the arrow. Yep, there it goes. It's heading to the lungs. So all this mess, and now you're seeing the numbers 45. Here it was 40. Once blood goes through the tissue cells, now the number's higher because it's picked up CO2. And now it's going back to the heart, to the right atrium, right ventricle, and then it's being pumped, the pulmonary circulation to the lungs. Now, like it says here, transfer from blood, and I should say we have 2 lungs. Okay, so here's an alveolus. Here's that permeable membrane. Here is the CO2 dissolved in plasma. See how it's moving into the alveolus. Here is the carbaminohemoglobin, which then will break into hemoglobin, and it kicks off this carbon dioxide. It moves across. All this is happening by diffusion. See, here's the 40, here's the 45, so it's a natural tendency for it to move this way. So here's that formula again. This bicarbonate ion, see the negative, it's an ion, it moves into the red blood cell, combines with the hydrogen ion, which never left. Okay, remember it attached to hemoglobin as well. It forms carbonic acid again, but then carbonic acid, and there's actually an enzyme, I didn't name the other one. This is called carbonic anhydrase that makes this bind to this to form that. Carbonic acid will then disassociate or split into water and CO2. And it doesn't show it, but see the CO2 moving into the lungs? The water does as well. And that is ventilated off. And that's what happens when blood reaches the lungs. This is how carbon dioxide is reassembled, and then it's able to be ventilated off into the atmosphere. When you breathe off, you don't breathe off bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. I can only imagine what that would be. Hydrogen ions are acidic. And so, and see the plus and the minuses here, when it's bound together, they lose all those properties. Okay, well, that is it. This is a nice overall diagram of the entire system. But that is it. And I hope you enjoyed this. Play it back. This part is really detailed, and I hope this video helps. Thanks.
And that's the bottom line, because